I'd like to welcome you to our forum on fixing healthcare and to thank Mark for inviting me to moderate it. My name is Susannah Rowe, and I am the founder of the Center for Innovative Eye Care Delivery at Boston Medical Center, and I'm also a practicing ophthalmic surgeon. So before we start and I introduce our expert panel, I'd like to just get a show of hands. How many in the audience has recently had, or a family member has recently had, a really, truly scary or difficult experience in the healthcare industry? Okay, so it looks like about, I can't see very well, but about half or more than half the audience. So in a country where the healthcare industry is supposed to be one of the best in the world, that's a pretty scary fact. So Mark has assembled here for us a panel of truly talented and passionate people who are deeply immersed right now today in some highly innovative ventures to help us address many of the problems that we see. I'd like to introduce Doug Smith, who's the CIO for Martins Point Healthcare for the last 5 years. Martins Point is an owner-operator of primary care clinics along the coast from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Portland and Brunswick, Maryland. These clinics serve about 40,000 patients. As a provider and payer of healthcare, Martins Point is positioned to experiment with new approaches to delivering and paying for healthcare. Our second panelist is John Celi, who's a partner in Accenture's Health and Life Sciences practice. He is currently the lead technical architect on Accenture's United States Department of Health and Human Services Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. And he's developing a prototype for a nationwide health information network. Ali Parsa is the chairman of the Center of Clinical Excellence, which aims to give back the power in healthcare to healthcare professionals, I like that, by building 20 multidisciplinary hospitals in the United Kingdom, in which all of those who contribute are given co-ownership. Ali was an entrepreneur before he decided, as he says, to grow up and become an investment banker with Goldman Sachs. And he now tells me he's had enough of the grown-up life. So I'd like to begin by asking Doug to tell us a little bit about how this forum started and how it came to FiRe.
Well, I've been a subscriber to SNS for probably 5-6 years and have enjoyed it quite a bit. Last year was the first time I attended the FiRe conference. And it was coincident in that it occurred about 2 weeks after Mark had put out a particular issue on the 5th of May entitled U.S. Healthcare Basically Broken. And usually Mark's fairly articulate, he always is articulate, but also fairly brief in his introductory remarks in the newsletter, 2-3 pages. I was struck by the fact that this particular edition had 9 pages with a number of it sounded like personal stories recounted. It clearly was something that had energized Mark. So at the conference, during one of the breaks, I had the occasion to talk with him and say, there's a large part of healthcare that we're not talking about in this conference. It's basically a $2 trillion a year business in the United States. We talk about nanotechnology and some of the other tremendous inventions that are taking place in the medical and pharma business, but not the administration of healthcare. The healthcare that gets down to the people who are receiving it and really have to judge whether there's a value for what they're receiving, have to deal with the errors and that kind of thing. So Mark said, why not? We'll put it on for next year. So it was with a little bit of surprise that a couple weeks ago I saw an email that said that we had formed this panel. But thank you for doing it.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what you see are the current challenges in healthcare today. Maybe John, you can start.
Sure. I think that there's 2 comments about healthcare, the state of healthcare right now. The first one is that healthcare is, with the possible exception of education, as was pointed out to me last night, is the last industry that's truly screwed up. Most of the other industries have figured out how to deal with competition, get efficiencies, and squeeze out more and more efficiency, more capability, more capacity into their processes. Healthcare has pretty much been flatlined for the past 50 years. I would also say that the healthcare system is broke. Healthcare, or the healthcare technology, is the best it's ever been, and it keeps improving all the time. And I think that's an important distinction that, we have the technology, we have the science, we have the improvements that are there, but the system in which it lives in, the delivery on how it's done is broken.
Doug, you want to?
It's always challenging to try and collapse down to just a few issues. What are the causal roots, if you will, of the problem? But I think I would summarize it in two broad areas, building off of what John has said. One is that quality, although everyone in this audience has had encounters with healthcare and you have some vision of what a quality experience might be, it's rare that you actually experience it in a healthcare environment, I would posit. And part of the reason is you don't know what to measure. You don't know what to expect. And regrettably, the industry is filled with problems that are, some of them systemic, others are errors, things like that. The crux of it is that we don't have measures, we don't have a way to measure quality that's transparent and understood. And that builds to the second point, which is one of alignment. And in the alignment area, it's a matter of aligning people's expectations, financial incentives, care, the evidence-based medicine that one would expect is followed. It's the science in medicine as delivered. It's known. Why isn't it followed? Why isn't my experience like that? So broadly, it's a matter of quality and how you measure it and how you make sure that you get it when you see a physician or have an experience with a healthcare system. And then the alignment. And I think the underpinnings of it is what John got to, which is the systems, the technology, the standards, the information that's required both to, if you will, enforce the alignment, but also make transparent to people the measures of quality.
But I think that also there are gross sort of measures that are out there. In this country, we kill almost, or due to medical mistakes, almost 100,000 people are killed each year. An additional 100,000 die because of infections that they received in the hospital. That's 20 people an hour. In the half an hour up here, there'll be 10 people that die because of these problems. And then there's another 500,000 people a year that have an illness or infection that's non-fatal.
And I can say as a physician working on a national level on defining quality that we do increasingly have really excellent measures, particularly of processes that we know lead to good quality and to lead to good outcomes. So I think that we're moving now as an industry to being able to actually say what we think is good care. I would disagree that probably everybody here hasn't experienced good quality, but what you see is a mosaic, a mixture of really fantastic quality, good experiences, sometimes often physicians who truly care, and nurses and other providers, and a system that leads to really scary mistakes and other problems. So I think it's very, very uneven. It's not that it's not good.
I don't think the issue on healthcare, you're absolutely right. The issue on healthcare is not quality. I think the issue on healthcare is it's a system that just never grew up. It's a system, therefore it became, I remember when I was a kid in the underdeveloped Iran, and I went to a doctor. The doctor wanted to get my records. He would send the porter down, say Pedro, and Pedro has to go all the way down the steps, pick up all my records, bring it all the way up the steps, and give it to the doctor. When I moved to UK, and you need to kind of picture that as before I moved to UK, my only understanding of UK was formed by one single guy. The things I read about him and the films I watched about him, his name was Bond, James Bond. So when I arrived in UK, it was amazing to see that I had exactly the same equivalent of Pedro going all the way down the stairs, picking up the records and coming all the way down the stairs. I think the bad news about healthcare is that it's unsustainable. We were told 2 nights ago, and it's absolutely true, that our life expectancy is growing by about 5 hours every day. The technology in healthcare has fundamentally changed. It's become a lot more expensive, but also a lot more diversified. But I think by far more important is that we have a generational change. The generation that changed being young in the 60s and changed being middle-aged in the 80s are now going to become consumers of healthcare. And they will consume healthcare fundamentally differently than the previous generation. That makes healthcare, as it's delivered today, unsustainable. And I think that's the bad news about healthcare, that we need to fundamentally change, fundamentally re-engineer the way it's delivered. And I think the good news is we've been here before. Back in the 50s, we re-engineered the delivery and the distribution of food. in the 60s, retail in the 70s, car industry, manufacturing in the 80s, financial sector where I come from, in the 90s, the telecoms and airlines. And every single time, the result has been immeasurably high quality, cheaper, more available, more accessible products. And I think exactly the same needs to happen in healthcare. The system is unsustainable, needs fundamental re-engineering to get it there.
The system hasn't changed. I mean, both the UK and the US have the same systems that were set up after World War II.
That's what I mean.
They
It didn't grow
flatlined
up.
for
It didn't grow up.
50 years.
I'm reminded of when I was in graduate school, a health economics professor I had said when the percentage of GNP devoted to healthcare was a little bit over 8%, it could never get to double digits. Well, now it's north of 16% and threatens to be the Pac-Man consuming our budget. But I want to get back to what Ali was saying, because there is something fundamentally different. This is the train wreck that people have been predicting for decades. And I think what's fundamentally changing is the baby boomers, at least in this country. We have the proverbial, pig going through the python. This is a generation who has gone quietly through no phase of life. They're activists by genes, I think, let alone breeding and raising. And they're getting to a place now where their demand for healthcare is going to go vertical.
Yep.
And they're going to find that although they may have disposable income, they're demanding, they're activated, and that's, I think, the critical tipping point.
And Doug, what do we do about this? We do exactly what Ross Perot told us not to do, right, in healthcare, which is we see a snake, you kill the snake. You don't form a committee on a snake. Right. And what have we done? In healthcare, everybody forms committees. Nobody deals with the issue. It's like a committee after committee. Why? Because it's centralized, it's a monopolistic delivery outside the United States, almost everywhere. And the way to solve the problem, I think, is to liberalize healthcare in the same way that we liberalize every other section of our delivery. Why the car industry got fixed in the 70s? Because the Japanese could go back to the scratch, build it from a blank sheet of paper, and then I had the choice to buy it or not buy it. And I think we should do exactly the same thing. Give back the power to the consumer. That doesn't mean that we all have to pay for our own healthcare, because I think that's wrong. I think all of us, most of us in this room, will sometimes at some stage get into a disease that our own pocket may not be deep enough for it. So I think that healthcare is one area where a community needs to pull together, be it through an insurance or be it national health service, whatever it is. But the delivery of healthcare, the problem of solving the disease, the fixing of the problem for the patient needs to be liberalized so patients can choose where their money gets spent. And if you do that, you'll have a fundamental difference in the delivery. I mean, just look just north of here on your specialty, LASIK, for instance, on ophthalmology. Look at the competition that happened between British Columbia in Canada and the state of Washington. You could do LASIK in everywhere else in the world now at around $2,000 an eye. In that part of the world, you get it done at $250 an eye. Yeah. And that's what competition does. That's what liberalization of healthcare does. And it's actually high quality, because why? Because that's where they practice. Practice makes it great.
So Ali, when you say liberalize, you mean liberalize the choices of patients about where they would go to get their care?
Yeah, I mean, look, in our country, in UK, for the very first time from 2008, a patient will have the choice to go to whichever hospital they want to go to. Incredible. They are given one single choice today in the 21st century. You're sick, it doesn't matter how bad or good your hospital is. It doesn't matter if 20 people have died of MRSA in that hospital in the last day or so. You got one single choice in UK on where you go to. So what is the incentive for that hospital to get any better? None, zero. And the way to fix that is to bring competition into healthcare in the same way that it was in everywhere else, and I think competition will fix it. It will regenerate it, and it will allow the best talents to come in. I mean, look at the results of just that one single thing, that allowing of patients to choose. Businesses like ours have started. We're building hospitals. And what do? We don't go and get an ordinary person to come and build a hospital. You go and get great talents to come and build hospitals.
There's a real good series in the Harvard Business Review recently, last year, on how to fix healthcare, and they had three conclusions, or three assertions. The first one was introducing this concept of competition, and Michael Porter is releasing a book in June that covers that more deeply. The second is process improvement, and it's some of the work that Susannah is doing in her clinic at BMC. And this is around using something like the Toyota process or production system, where you use continuous improvement on looking at the simplest of processes inside a hospital or and where clinical work is done. And the third is, once you start figuring out these processes and once you start introducing the competition, you're going to have innovation that you didn't have before. And those three legs of the stool, if you will, are what they are asserting is
So not to be a devil's advocate, but we've talked about this a little bit in the last couple of days. I think for competition to work, you need to have informed consumers.
Right.
And they need to be able to choose what their level of quality, they need to be able to distinguish quality. And I would say that I think consumers could choose what's more convenient and what feels more comfortable, and to a large extent that does mediate quality. But other measures of quality of care, I don't think I personally, even as a physician with lots of context in healthcare, would necessarily know how to choose who was a good surgeon to take out my appendix. I would go to a friend, or I might call the nurses in the operating room and say, hey, who's good in the OR?
Well, I think that's changing. I mean, you have websites out there that rate doctors individually, sort of the Amazon star mechanism.
But they rate them on popularity of patients, and they rate them on things like malpractice and complication rates.
On value they perceive they get.
So
Bedside manner, quality of care, you know.
and we know that you can have, I mean, all physicians who are in the field see, certainly I see ophthalmologists who have terrible care that they offer their patients, but they never get sued, and their patients love them because they hold their hands and they talk to them, they spend time with them, and meanwhile, they're blinding the patients. So how do you, literally, in many cases, so how do you get to a place where, and I'm just pushing the envelope a little bit, how can we define, how can we incorporate these kinds of measures of quality of care, of outcomes, into competition?
Well, it's a great question, and we constantly banter back and forth about the difference between affability and capability. Unfortunately, that's often what people judge by, is the bedside manner of the physician. I'm reminded of some friends who've gone into the hospital business. In the absence of a true measure of outcomes and that kind of thing, when patients are asked what their hospital experience was and whether they were satisfied, often they're measuring it based on how convenient the parking was. That's pretty sad commentary on where we are. We haven't exposed the data that enable people to be informed consumers. And I think what we're seeing in the panel here is really a reporting of what is, not necessarily what any one of us want to be. But there are web pages out there, indeed, with some comparisons, like a mobile guide we use in Maine right now, ribbons. So you get 2 or 3 ribbons, depending on how good a practice you are. But when you scratch the surface and you see what they're being measured on, it's not where we want to be. So I think the big challenge is to come up with those measures, to make them publicly available. That's that transparency concept, and to energize them with some kind of
That's what you see driving the whole, what I call RIO, Regional Health Information Organization, and what the NHS is trying to do in the UK, in that it's at a sort of community level or geographic level, they're gathering data about your information and able to present it in a longitudinal health record perspective. And that you would be able to, once all that data is in an accessible format, you could then be able to do some of those quality measures and start to really
John, Susannah is absolutely right. The issue of quality in healthcare is a very, very difficult issue to define. I mean, we have now about 600 partners, consultant doctors, who work within our organization. We sit with them and try to figure out how do you measure quality. And I tell you, before I started those sessions, I used to be 6'4", blue eyes and blonde hair. I mean, it's impossible, absolutely impossible, to get 10 physicians to agree on a measure of quality.
And I think 10 physicians, you got 12 opinions.
Right. Yeah. And I think on that one, the answer, I'm with you, that the answer's got to go back to the patients.
Yeah.
And part of it is, I mean, look, on eBay, I buy something today from a guy I have zero idea who he is on the other side of the planet. But what do? I go and read about his performance by other eBay writers, other consumers who've used them and said, the guy is great, or the guy has delivered on time, so I know he's trustworthy. And I think you allow that to happen. I think those tools need to be invented in healthcare that will put power back in the hands of the patients, and that will fix it.
We say in medicine that organizing physicians is like herding cats, and I think that's true. I'm mindful that we have just a few more minutes, so I'd like to take a moment and ask each of you, why should the technology sector care about these problems? What kinds of, maybe John, you can talk a little bit about RIOs and exactly what kind of things you're doing with technology to help these problems?
Well, I think that
Maybe you can define a RIO for us.
so RIO is a RIO is an organization that comes together, maybe a collection of hospitals, it may be a state government, where they are trying to they have a couple of objectives. The first one is to be able to pass medical data transactionally. So you're in an emergency room in a hospital that in a hospital that you don't normally go to. How do they get the drugs that you're on? How do they know what you're allergic to? The answer is the RIO will hold that information and pass it to the clinician that is providing care. The other aspects they'll use with it is for population management. So being able to look at disease outbreaks and those types of sort of broader range population type of queries. Additionally, once you have, so the reason why RIOs are popular right now is because if you look at Medicare, that is something the federal government's concerned about. Medicaid, which is down at the state level, which serves the poor population, the states are scared about. So what is driving all those costs? And a lot of it can be directly related to management of chronic disease, can be in a number of other parts. The RIOs are being structured to be able to address those problems, that you can, in a much more cost-efficient manner, address chronic disease and be able to provide an infrastructure in which you can alert on outbreaks, that you can provide critical information to somebody who's broken their leg in LA than when they live in Boston, and that type of thing. So I think that, and we have the technology and the know-how to be able to build these systems today. We know how to create structures and technical algorithms that will manage privacy, patient privacy, and confidentiality. As Doug was saying earlier, it's not about the technology, it's about the policy.
We haven't put it together in the systems that make sense.
Can I actually, I think your question was a very good one, and that is, why should the technology sector be interested in healthcare? And I think there is, is anybody interested in anything? There is three incentives: is the moral, is the social, and is the economic. And I think while there has always been the moral and the social incentive, in healthcare for the first time now we have the economic incentive. This is an industry that is going to be fundamentally re-engineered. And anything that is fundamentally re-engineered and reinvented will create significant potentials for creation of value. And I think it's absolutely imperative that people get involved in healthcare and technology. The technology we have in healthcare today, it's bad. It sucks. It's the same thing as the architecture we had for healthcare. And when we wanted to build hospitals, we just didn't employ a single person who's built a hospital before, because by vast majority of the hospitals, and I don't know about US, but in UK certainly, if you're healthy, you go in there and you feel sick. And so what did we do? We took Norman Foster's and Richard Rogers, and we told them, if you were going to build a hospital, what would you do? Go break a leg. And I think the same is true on technology. We would love to work with anybody in this room and say, we're building 20 hospitals. We would love to figure out how we can roll out the most advanced technology that can help the patients at the end of the day.
Information technology as opposed to healthcare technology.
Information technology, because healthcare technology, you're right, is getting there bit by bit.
So Ali, what you're saying is that thinking outside the box, people who aren't coming from the healthcare industry have a lot to offer because it's so fundamentally broken that people who come from other industries have the
capabilities
opportunity.
there are very immature. The software that you can buy for healthcare.
Most of what you need, Susannah, for healthcare, actually, for technology for healthcare, is not new. It could actually be a commodity technology in another sector. It's just not
hasn't
there.
been applied.
You need to be able to see your patient, probably on the other side of the world, and be able to communicate with them. And without that patient needing to fly to Boston to see you, if there was some basic diagnostics tool available for that patient back where they were, so they can use your brain power as opposed to, the feel and touch.
And I think increasingly physicians are comfortable with that concept as we're thinking about trying to find ways to get some of the more technical and routine aspects of patient care off our plate so that we actually have some time to take care of patients, to have the difficult conversations, to help guide them through difficult decisions.
It's certainly true with radiology as an example, reading images around the world. So.
We have just 4 minutes left, so I want to open up the floor to questions.
I mean, one quick point, I won't take more than 30 seconds. We've talked about the industry, technology's impact and a value proposition that could be provided there, that there's a market there, as Ali and John were bringing out. But there's also, as a manufacturer, producer of IT, your costs are driven up by healthcare. There's more,
As an employer,
No
yeah.
question.
GM spends more on healthcare than they do on the metal in the car. Of course, there may not be as much metal as there used to be, but the point is still there. As a manufacturing, this is making you uncompetitive. So
Yeah.
in this country, we are losing jobs because of healthcare costs. So.
Yes, can I take the first question?
My name is Jan Bolt. If anybody in this room has a parent, a close friend that has a stroke or a heart attack, most of the time you don't know their physicians. And most of the time those people don't know the specialists that are going to be called in. And if they're hospitalized, I would highly, highly recommend getting a patient advocate, getting somebody with medical knowledge to watch over their care while they're hospitalized. And the question I have for the panel is, are there such organizations out there where you can hire independent people to watch the medicines that are given? A lot of these people that go in that are elderly are, stroke victims, heart attack victims. They're given medication to basically paralyze them so they're not a problem with the nurses. Doesn't necessarily help in them recovering from these illnesses. Are there organizations out there that are patient advocate groups? Are there companies that are forming to provide those kind of services? And do hospitals have any liaison staffs now that work with those people that are independent, that come in to watch over the individual patients?
So I think that increasingly we are seeing liaisons in hospitals that do perform some of those functions, but not nearly enough. We also are seeing an increasing disease management system where a hospital might actually develop a system for taking care of stroke, for example, where you have a liaison, you have a whole team of people, and the patient gets plugged in. But I agree with you, and I think that there's a great opportunity for such services to be developed. Personally, as a physician, I just did it this morning. It's a terrifying experience when a family member is sick, and I spend a lot of time watching over them. And I think everybody should have that.
I think that there's an emerging new career in this field that we call healthcare coach. And it's not just about, so if I have two pieces of advice for people about healthcare. One is, if you get into the hospital, have someone, and if you can get a coach, great, or an advocate, great. But all you need is someone to sit there and watch the stuff that goes on and monitor it, because there are mistakes made, and you need someone that's cogent, thinking about all the stuff happening. And the second thing is, if you have any type of chronic illness like diabetes or asthma, get copies of all of your documentation and carry it around in your folder. They did a study in the UK that said a standard cancer care patient saw 30 clinicians in a year. And all those clinicians didn't have any of the information that the previous clinician had. So it was up to you to make sure that it's up to you to make sure your medical record is complete, and you carry it around and you hand it to people as you go visit. But there is an emerging field where there's healthcare coach, and it's not only for quality of care in hospitals, but it's also navigating the insurance industry on how, what are the procedures that are appropriate, what are procedures that will be reimbursed, and that type of thing.
I think we have time for one other question.
Hi, Peter Biddle. I have an uncle, and he was a radiologist for 20 years and was an expert witness in a number of malpractice suits for his practice and friends in Fairbanks, Alaska. He got so fed up with it, he quit being a doctor, and he's now in law school to become a lawyer.
Yeah.
You haven't talked at all about malpractice. I was wondering if you could comment on that in the United States or globally.
Wow, we need another half an hour.
Yeah.
I think that, just to put my 2 cents in, I think that the legal system in this country needs some reform in terms of settlements and the ways in which cases are heard. Perhaps Susannah can comment on this, but cases are brought and not only without foundation, but always have a devastating effect on physicians, personally and otherwise. So I think there's a real need for tort reform, just from my viewpoint.
And I would second that. We're out of time now, so I just want to summarize and say that I think that we have scratched the surface of a number of issues that are, I think, very relevant to the technology sector. And I think especially in a forum like this, there's a great need for a multidisciplinary dialogue among innovators, people who think outside the box, and people who are really passionate about social change to start trying to figure out how to change the system. I think we have all the building blocks that we need to develop a fantastic healthcare system here in the US and overseas as well, and we just need to be getting together with, as Ali says, some people who have fresh ideas and fresh ways of looking at things to help us solve these problems.
I think later on today there's a breakout session if you'd like to
Yes.
talk in more depth.
Thank you.